Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Natalie McKee, and I am a senior here at Hillsdale College studying English and journalism, and I have the honor this afternoon of introducing Dr. Grant Wacker. He is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus of Christian History at Duke Divinity School and earned his PhD from Harvard University. A trustee of the Fuller Theological Seminary, he previously taught in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is past president of the Society for Pentecostal Studies of the American Society of Church History, and he is a former senior editor of the journal Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture. He is the author and co-editor of several books, including Heaven Below, Early Pentecostals and American Culture, Religion in the 19th Century America, and America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation. Please join me in welcoming him tonight.
Thank you, Natalie. It was a gracious invitation. It is a great honor to be here today. I've never been to Hillsdale, for that matter. I've never been in Central Michigan. And so I've heard a great deal about Hillsdale over the years, and so finally I have a chance to come. And thank you to Matt for inviting me. And not the least of the pleasures of coming is that two very dear friends I've known, it seems like forever, Daryl and Ann Hart, are here as well. Daryl is a historian, teaches U.S. history, and it's very, very nice to see both Daryl and Ann here. Well, when I saw the lineup of speakers, I have to say I was intimidated. And so I told my wife about this lineup of speakers, and I told her how intimidated I was. And she said, look, don't try to be intellectual, don't try to be profound, don't try to be funny, just be yourself. So that's where we are. I'm going to just try to be myself this afternoon. Okay. I want to start with a couple of preliminary comments. I tell my graduate students at Duke, never start with a preliminary comment. But none of my graduate students is here, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. Okay. The first one is a minor one about scope. And today I will talk about Billy Graham, but in the context of American life and culture. He is very much an international figure, and I think in the long run, we might find that Graham's ministry overseas was even more important than what he did in the United States. But working on Graham in the United States was work enough for one day, one lifetime for me. And so that is my focus, though I would welcome any questions about the overseas part. The second is that several of you have asked me about him. And the person who gave me a ride from the airport a couple of days ago asked me if he was still alive, and the answer is very much yes. He is approaching 98 years old. He lives in his house that he has been in for something like 70 years. It's on a mountaintop near Asheville, North Carolina. A relatively modest house, actually. And what's most surprising to me is that he lives alone. He does have nurses around the clock and 8-hour shifts, but other than that, he's alone. And so, I mean, it's just astonishing to me, this man who has been in intense interaction with hundreds of thousands of people throughout his life, and now in the end of his life, he chooses this. And I think he spends a lot of time just looking at the mountains in relatively good health for a man who's approaching 98. My assigned topic today is Billy Graham, the relationship of life and times. Now, this is a capacious topic, and it would take hours, if not days, to fully cover it. So, this afternoon, I want to focus on a more manageable but equally important question. And that question is how Graham shaped his times. It's almost needless to say that the times shaped him, too. But I wish to argue that through sheer force of mind, will, and personality, Graham etched deep lines in the sands of his age. Now, let me first say a few words about Graham's stature on the American religious landscape in the long second half of the 20th century. And though he's familiar to students of American religion, and probably to most people in this room as well, a 2007 Gallup poll revealed that nearly one-third of Americans under the age of 30 had absolutely no idea who he was or who he is. It's worth remembering what one Wall Street Journal reviewer recently said about Graham's place in post-World War II America. He said, "It's easy to forget what a big deal he was in his time." For more than 5 decades, Graham ranked as one of the most influential voices in the Christian world. Born on a farm near Charlotte, North Carolina, Graham spent the early years of his ministry mainly as an itinerant speaker for Youth for Christ in the Midwest. But highly publicized crusades in Los Angeles in 1949 and then in New York in 1957 hurled him into the national and international spotlights. And he held that iconic position for the rest of the century and beyond. Graham's achievements piled up like snowdrifts, just a few. Most notably, nearly 215 million people around the world heard him preach in person, probably more than any other person in history. Additional hundreds of millions heard him by way of electronic media. Between 1955 and last year, he scored a spot on Gallup's list of 10 most admired men in the world 59 times, nearly twice the figure of his closest rival, Ronald Reagan. In that regard, Graham was less a preacher than a Protestant saint. With help from journalism giants William Randolph Hearst and Henry R. Luce, Graham masterfully adapted his old-fashioned gospel to new media. Besides more than 30 books that he either authored or authorized, he introduced the Hour of Decision weekly national radio program in 1950, the Hour of Decision quarterly network television program in 1951, Worldwide Pictures, a feature-length film division in 1951, My Answer, a daily syndicated advice column in 1952 with a potential readership of 20 million people a day. He introduced Christianity Today, a serious theological fortnightly in 1956, and Decision magazine, a popular magazine in 1960. At one point, Decision reached 6 million. All of the other radio broadcasts and television, Worldwide Pictures, they too reached millions. Whatever else Graham was, he was a man of bold ambitions. His international crusades and evangelism conferences, especially Lausanne in 1974, helped make his name a household word, not only in the United States, but in many other parts of the world. Graham personally knew 12 presidents of the United States. He claimed 10 of them as friends. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and the older Bush, and their first ladies were all close friends. For more than 5 decades, Graham enjoyed extraordinary, if not unique, access to the pinnacle of political and cultural power. Many viewed Graham unfavorably, but their attacks also served as a mark of status. His susceptibility to the glamour of celebrities, the clout of the ultra-rich, and the influence of high-ranking politicians troubled his friends and energized his foes. His odious remarks about Jews in the media, uttered in private in Nixon's Oval Office in 1972, but revealed in 2002, tarnished his record. His repeated apologies lightened but never eased the stain. Yet most disturbing for all but the most ardent followers was Graham's political posture in the 1960s and the early 70s. His support for the Vietnam War and his jut-jawed defense of Nixon during Watergate lingered long after most Americans had given up on both causes. Many called him the White House chaplain. Some observers' harsh attitudes toward Graham did soften over time. Martin Marty's pilgrimage represented many others. In 1988, on the occasion of Graham's 70th birthday, this mainline Lutheran clergyman and one of the most renowned historians in the world admitted that in times past he had grumbled in print about Graham's approach. But now in 1988, Marty judged, and this is a wonderful quotation, that left and right, liberal or conservative, mean less than mean and non-mean. And Graham, to our great fortune, has been of the non-mean variety. Marty kept moving. In a conference just a couple of years ago, just down the street at Wheaton College, the conference was devoted to analyzing Graham's legacy. And Marty said that the Mount Rushmore of American religious history clearly included four figures: Jonathan Edwards, Martin Luther King, and Billy Graham. And then Marty winked, and he said, I haven't decided on the fourth one yet. If you all know Marty, you know how characteristic that is, but this is a remarkable change. Letters from ordinary people to Graham reveal his status too. I'll say more about them later. But here the point to notice is the sheer magnitude of the letters, running to millions posted during the 6 decades he strode the public stage. Children's letters are significant in their own way. I love them. One child's letter posted in 1971, probably from a first or second grader, I assume, from the handwriting. The letter spoke for a lot. After a free book, a young author signed off, "Tell Mr. Jesus hi." Now think about that. What that says about Graham's interaction with popular culture. The envelopes that carried the letters from adults, now exhibited in the Billy Graham Library Showcase, are very revealing too. Some bore only a sketchy address, some had wildly inaccurate addresses, and some had no addresses at all. One that I saw simply had a picture of Billy Graham taped on the front. But they all made it. They got to his headquarters. One that I especially liked included a full and accurate address, but down in the lower left-hand corner, the writer had scrawled, "In case of rapture, never mind." Now, these stories tell us a great deal about the depth and breadth of Graham's interaction with popular culture. I'm going to offer one additional anecdote that goes far to document Graham's influence, in this case, beyond evangelical circles. It comes from a very unlikely source, Bob Dylan, who was interviewed in the AARP magazine last May. Now, I know you're all wondering, why would he be reading AARP magazine? Well, my wife gave it to me. Okay. Dylan himself is 74 years old, and this is what Dylan said, and it's autobiographical. "The greatest preacher and evangelist of my time was Billy Graham. That guy can save souls, and he did. I went to 2 or 3 of his rallies in the 50s and 60s, and this guy was like rock and roll personified, volatile, explosive. He had the hair, the tone, the elocution. When he spoke, he brought the storm down." If I could rename my book, that's what I would call it. He brought the storm down. "Clouds parted. Souls got saved, sometimes 30 or 40,000 of them." Well, that's an exaggeration, but It's on the way. If you ever went to a Billy Graham rally back then, you were changed forever. There was never a preacher like him. He could fill football stadiums before anybody. He could fill the Giants stadium even more than the Giants could fill them. Seems like a long time ago, long before Mick Jagger sang his first note, or before Bruce strapped on his first guitar. That's some part of the rock and roll era that I retained. I had to. I saw Billy Graham in the flesh, and I heard him loud and clear. It's from Bob Dylan. Despite Graham's Olympian status, his long-term impact on his times, we might call it a legacy, is surprisingly elusive and hard to pin down. The historian Stephen Miller put it this way: Graham's public persona was always subtler and more oblique than his strident platform rhetoric and vivid media presence seemed to imply. Elsewhere, Miller captured the point with brilliant succinctness. He said, Billy Graham may be America's most complicated innocent. A line that the journalist David Brooks applied to Dwight Eisenhower recently applied equally well to Graham. Brooks said, he looked simple and straightforward, but his simplicity was a work of art. Think about that. Now, for clarity, I will break Graham's impact on the times into 4 components. The first deals with religious ideas, the second with evangelical culture, the third with American society, and the fourth with the politics of hope. And at the end, I want to hazard a few comments about successors for Graham. So first of all, religious ideas. I need to check my time here. Beginning then with ideas. It's important to notice that some of his ideas remained fixed throughout his career. And by my count, there were 7 religious, or some people would say doctrinal ideas. Now, we might call them evangelical boilerplate, but one of the reasons they are evangelical boilerplate is because Graham articulated them so often. He gave these ideas the appearance of always having been here, and the way he said it. And briefly, I would say biblical authority, the Trinity, original and universal sin, a new birth through faith in Christ, the necessity of moral and ethical growth after the new birth, mission, something so wonderful has to be shared, and then finally, the 7th, a final destiny of heaven or hell. Now, these were stable ideas that never changed. However, those 7 claims, though they remain fixed at the core, the way Graham interpreted and presented them did change over time. So I want to talk a little bit about how Graham changed those core ideas, and then what that says about how those ideas were received by the millions who heard him. First of all, over the span of his career, Graham moved from notions of biblical inerrancy and literalism to a larger and more dynamic sense of biblical authority. Simply put, the Bible was authoritative not because it was accurate in every detail of history and science, but because it did what it promised to do. It infallibly brought people to repentance and faith in Christ. In a variety of ways, Graham said that he trusted the Bible because it worked in his own life and because it worked in the lives of the people who heard him. From there, Graham moved backwards to say that the Bible evinced substantial accuracy in matters of history and science. But the key for him was not inerrancy or literalism, but infallibility, the ability of the Bible to bring people to Christ. That's one change. Second change related to Graham's understanding of the new birth. In the early days, he effectively called for a this-moment conversion. Stand up, walk to the front, sign a decision card, join a church, and then go out and bear witness. And as noted, his trademark radio and television programs had this bracing title, Hour of Decision. His popular magazine had the same title, even more bracing, Decision. And the point was clear. Choose Christ now, right now. But over time, Graham came to acknowledge that inquirers registered their faith in Christ in other ways. He allowed that many people, including his wife Ruth, never experienced a moment of decision. Rather, they grew up committed Christians and they never saw themselves otherwise. More to the point, Graham came to see that the majority of people in his crusade, hear me, the majority of people in his crusades were not making a first-time commitment, but actually a recommitment. Of those, most had been members of other churches, but they had drifted away. And Graham called them to come back to faith and shoulder the responsibility of being a Christian. Graham's notion of moral and ethical results that should follow the new birth also changed over time. This is the third one. Now, he always retained a primary emphasis upon individual conversion. That point should be emphasized. But he also came to appreciate the need for an intentional move from individual conversion to working for social and structural reform. He knew that move wouldn't take place automatically. Converted hearts did not automatically produce converted hands. This kind of social and structural reform was never the center of his message, but over time he came to say that it's important for Christians to support civil rights laws and other kinds of laws that brought about those reforms. Graham's notion of mission broadened from a forthright verbal proclamation of the gospel to a more inclusive effort to bring as many people as possible within the range of his voice. Many people, especially fundamentalists, charged Graham with compromising. A clear example of that was the president of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones in 1966 said that Billy Graham is doing more harm to the cause of Jesus Christ than any other living man. Graham was hurt, but he never changed his tactics. His tactic always was bring as many people within the range of your voice as you possibly can without sacrificing your core message. He did the same with mainline Protestants. Work with them if they'll work with you, with Catholics, with Pentecostals, with Mormons. Over and over, he said, if they will work with me and do not ask me to change my message, I'll work with them. Now today, the idea of evangelicals working with Catholics it's no big deal. But he started doing that in 1950, and it was a big deal in 1950, and it provoked the everlasting ire of fundamentalists. Graham simply wouldn't listen to the critics. Same thing with Pentecostalism. Seems like not a big deal today to work with Pentecostals or for Pentecostals to work with other evangelicals. But when Graham started doing this in the 50s and 60s, it was a big deal, and it took a major act of courage. Graham also called for an ironic approach to world religions. Now, this gets controversial, but I'm willing to stand with it. Graham never trimmed his insistence that Christ was the only way to heaven, but he saw no point in attacking other people's religions or other people's traditions, as countless evangelicals did. Now, a few times in the early years, he violated his own principles, but as he matured, certainly from the 70s onward, he went to great effort to avoid criticizing anyone by name and certainly not going into other cultures and criticizing their faith. He said repeatedly, my job is to preach the gospel and not go to other cultures and disparage them. Most controversially, the older Graham refused to speculate about the ultimate fate of non-believers. To reporters who asked, he invariably said the same thing. That's up to God, and I'm not going to play God. William Martin is the dean of Graham Scholars, and Bill Martin put it this way. Part of Graham's change came from his wider exposure to a variety of peoples and cultures. If you've been everywhere, and if you know everybody, and if you've seen everything, it's hard to believe that there's only one way. evangelical culture. We've been talking about his impact on religious ideas. Let's turn to evangelical culture. I turn now to the second broad area of Graham's impact, evangelical culture. I'm especially intimidated talking about this with Daryl's presence because he's written a great deal about this topic, but I'm going to be brave and go ahead. The short of it is this: Graham became a badge of credibility for evangelicals. He brought evangelicals out of the cultural closet, and he taught them how to take a seat at the table of public conversation. In Graham's shadow, evangelicalism actually sometimes became a style rather than a theological position. One of the finest historians of American religion, a man named Samuel S. Hill, once put it this way, tongue-in-cheek: Billy taught evangelicals when to wear a necktie. Along the way, Billy also taught the press that there were differences among evangelicals, and there certainly were differences between evangelicals and fundamentalists. For many years, Billy defined the center of the evangelical tradition. George Marsden, historian many of you are familiar with, down the road, Calvin. Marsden said it perfectly. He said, he's quipping, but he said, an evangelical can well be defined as anyone who likes Billy Graham. The preacher persuaded many partisans, including me, that Christ did not die on the cross to save sinners from cigarettes or gambling or dancing or playing cards. Rather, Christ died to save people from their sinful natures and offer life everlasting both here and in the life to come. Graham was no Richard Baxter, he was no John Bunyan, but his preaching evoked a sense of where the heart of the Christian commitment should lie. One more aspect of his impact on evangelical culture: he taught evangelicals the importance of a practical approach to Christianity. We see this especially in the My Answer columns in the newspapers, where people would write in daily and ask every imaginable question, and these were what prompted most of those millions of letters that came in to the Graham headquarters. He didn't write the column himself, but he approved it. And it's striking how concrete, how practical the answers were. Now, most of them had a heavy dose of boilerplate theology, but they also brought with them just common sense drawn from biblical precepts. In Graham's mind, these guidelines worked because they have worked throughout history and because they're in the Bible. One of his favorite lines you get in the question and answer, in the My Answer column is, eggs cannot be unscrambled. Very telling letter. Woman who writes in, she said, I had a sexual experience with a man, not my husband, long before we were married. Should I tell him? Graham wrote back, and he said, that might make you feel good, but it will harm your marriage. Confess your sin to God and move on. And then eggs cannot be unscrambled. Graham embodied decency. This is the last point I'll mention regarding evangelical culture. Again, Bill Martin. He said, Graham represented Americans' best selves. Now, it's almost needless to say that Americans themselves didn't live up to their highest values, but Graham evinced an absolute commitment to marital fidelity, abjuring even activities that might raise eyebrows. Never dined alone with a woman, not his wife. Never traveled a woman, not his wife. Never had the door closed with a woman, not his wife. He was committed to financial transparency, again, without compromises. Lived on a public salary. Honesty about numbers reflected another kind of transparency. Tell the truth about the numbers of people. Not every crusade was a success. Sometimes they were flops, and he said it. Comparatively few people came. But most tellingly, reporters constantly asked him, how many converts have you had? To which he would always have the same answer. I have no idea. Only God knows who a convert is. So he called them inquirers because you could count inquirers, but you wouldn't know who a convert was. So that's the second area. First is religious ideas. The second is the changes he brought about in evangelical culture. Third area is American politics. These considerations are not going to bring me to say that he affected American political life the way a Lyndon Johnson or a Ronald Reagan or a Martin Luther King did. But he changed Americans in subtler ways, maybe more profound ways, ways that they thought. Leighton Ford, Graham's brother-in-law and a dear friend, put it perfectly. He said, Billy functioned as an arrowhead. On most things, the tip of the arrow pointed in a progressive direction. Now, that was not across the board. He was always behind the curve on women's rights in general and on women's ordination in particular. But to take a couple of examples, on the landmark issue of civil rights, Graham represented uneven, but on the whole, steady progress, especially when you remember that he was a white Southerner growing up in the 1920s and 1930s. As late as 1949, Graham endorsed segregation. That's the way things ought to be. In 1950, he began to change. He admonished his own Southern Baptist Convention for their failure to admit African Americans to their own seminaries. In 1953, he held a crusade in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Black people on one side, white people on the other, a rope down the middle, as the municipal law required. Somewhere in this month-long crusade, we don't know exactly when, he walked out and pulled the rope down. There was a lot of opposition. He insisted the rope comes down. Graham is a human. The next crusade was in Dallas, and the ropes went back up. He's feeling along the edges, coming to his moral position. And by 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education, he determined that those ropes would never again come back up. And he received ceaseless vilification from white friends and a fair number of death threats against himself and his wife and his children. To be sure, in the 1960s, he began to back off. Black Power, riots in the streets. He wasn't the only one who backed off and called for temperance in the civil rights movement. But by the 70s, he had come back fully fledged in full support of it. In 1982, in the Patriarchal Cathedral in Moscow, note, the Patriarchal Cathedral in Moscow, Graham said that he'd undergone 3 conversions in his life. The first was to Christ, the second was to racial justice, and the third was to nuclear disarmament. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Graham carried disarmament as a torch with growing vigor. He preached that civilization was on the brink of self-destruction, and that was not God's will. He called for discussion with the USSR of the two nations' differences. And I would say this move took enormous courage, because in those days, which I well remember, evangelicals were not in support of Graham's move toward mutual disarmament. When the 1980s came, the culture wars came, the Christian right, he said he agreed with some of their positions, but he said people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson didn't talk enough about poverty and hunger. And he said even if they did, partisan politics did not belong in the pulpit. Now, we have to say, Graham helped pioneer the cultural space that the Christian right eventually occupied. And we also have to say that some of Graham's own actions in those years were slippery, if not duplicitous, about his own backdoor involvement in partisan politics. Still in all, he insisted politics, partisan politics, does not belong in the pulpit. Now, I don't want to suggest that Graham's impact was free from flaws. He made at least one grievous mistake of a highly visible nature, and I've talked about this a bit, but I want to go back and focus some more. In 1972, he made odious remarks about Jews' stranglehold, as he called it, stranglehold on the media. And it was in a private meeting with President Richard Nixon and H.R. Haldeman in the Oval Office. Those remarks came to light in 2002. He was mortified. And so were Americans in general, and Jews in particular. Many Jews had considered Graham their friend. Graham apologized in print repeatedly, saying in a variety of ways, "I don't know why I said it. I did not feel that way about Jews then, and I certainly don't now, but that's no excuse." In the summer of 2002, a few months after these conversations came to light, Graham held a crusade in Cincinnati. It's the home of Hebrew Union University. He met with a delegation of rabbis. He said to them, "The things I said that day 30 years ago were unforgivable, but I beg you to forgive me." One person who was there that day remembers the scene as follows. He said, "The aging Graham, now in his 80s, came into the room and the rabbi stood. Graham asked him to sit down. He said, 'I'm the one who should be on my knees.'" Unlike many Graham supporters, including his son Franklin, Graham himself did not try to spin his mistake. He faced it squarely. He tried to make amends by apologizing straight up. I've scanned a lot of newspaper headlines, and my sense of it is that almost nobody forgave him, and they shouldn't have, but most, including most Jews, were willing to forgive. Finally, I want to look at, and I have to watch my time here, I want to look at the politics of hope. How Graham preached about the possibility of a second chance in life. This one transcended religious ideas, it transcended evangelical culture, it transcended American politics. For the lack of a better term, I'm going to call it the politics of hope. Beyond commitments or recommitments to Christ stood Graham's message that no matter how badly you have messed up your life, Christ's willingness to forgive offered a second chance. And the evidence lies in the millions of letters that flowed into the Minneapolis office. Only a tiny number of them have survived, but my wife was helping me, and we spent a couple of weeks reading through those letters. And they're remarkable for their testimonies of how people struggled with addictions, how they struggled with loneliness, most often older people whose children never came around, how they struggled with sexual deviance, and they wrote to Graham. And again, Graham said, Christ offers a second chance. And I'd argue that the ideal of a second chance goes back to the very beginning of American history. The Puritans imagined themselves as a city on a hill. Thomas Paine, revolutionary firebrand, said, "We have it in ourselves to start the world over again." 19th century holiness folk proclaimed a second moment of grace. The Statue of Liberty, which both of my Ukrainian grandparents saw in 1902 if they came by. The Statue of Liberty invited Europe's huddled masses to breathe free. And think of the names of our political parties. The Progressive Party, the New Deal, the Square Deal, the New Frontier, compassionate conservatism, and Yes We Can, all betoken Graham's instinctive sense that Americans were prepared to hear his message of a second chance. And here, too, we hear echoes of his impact on the ethos of the age. I want to say just a few words now. I'll keep this very brief. Will there be a successor to Graham? Reporters call and ask me this all the time, and my answer always is the same: no. And that takes them back. And I said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yep, I'm sure." And Decency. This is especially dogmatic coming from historians, because historians of all people have such a terrible track record of predicting anything. I say no for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's highly unlikely, extraordinarily unlikely, that another person with his voice and poise and timing and sincerity, humility, ambition for himself and for God, it just defies the odds that another person would come along. But part of that achievement, unique achievement, lies in the extraordinary stamina that he possessed. We don't often think about that. 60 years on the public stage. 60 years in which he knew that any slip could be fatal to his ministry. He once told the Pope, "We have a great bond because we are always on." You think of what that meant. He did succumb to the allure of hobnobbing with people of great power, but there was never a hint, ever, of deviance of personal propriety. There are other reasons why I think Graham will not be reproduced, but even if such a person were to come along, the America that created him and that he helped create has passed. We have to think about how America has changed, the kind of new world that we have. We no longer have the small nuclear family gathered around a flickering television screen watching Ozzie and Harriet. I remember that. In an age of social media and Instagram, would huge stadium crusades work anymore? The unprecedented devastation of World War II, the introduction of nuclear weapons, the specter of expansionist communism, the fragmentation of American culture in the face of racial and gender injustice, the rise of seemingly unbridgeable culture wars. They're just a few of the factors that marked Graham's age. And he provided answers for that age. Some of them were perennial answers about the human condition, but many of them addressed the age. It's hardly obvious to me that another person like Graham could address the age as he did. So the question is, what will happen? All right, write this down. Okay, this is Graham Wacker on this day, February 2, 2016. Here it is. I think we will see less heralded or unheralded figures who might not even know the name of Billy Graham. They will not be connected to centers of power. They will not be friends of billionaires and presidents and kings as Graham was. What will they look like? Well, drawing on wide reading in American history, a historian named Margaret Bendroth has perceptively sketched what such people will look like, and I think she's absolutely right. They will not be white. They will certainly not be white Americans. They will appeal to multi-ethnic audiences. They will affirm prosperity without falling into the theological morass of the prosperity gospel. Unhappily, all will be male. Yet, like Graham, they will esteem chastity, integrity, sincerity, ambition, humility, and hope. They will not be doctrinally argumentative. The doctrines that evangelicals fight about today will take second or third place behind an insistence on a life-changing experience with God in Christ, an experience that transforms every other experience of life. I conclude with a reference to Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan may have captured Graham's impact with uncanny precision. Bunyan said he had in his pocket a map of all the ways leading to or from the celestial city. Wherefore he struck a light, for he never goes without his tinderbox. One thing we know for sure, whoever Graham's successors may be, whether heralded or less heralded or unheralded, all of them will be living in a world that Billy Graham helped create. Thank you.
Dr. Wacker has agreed to sign copies of his book, America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation, immediately following this session. We now have time for a few questions.
You want me to, okay, yeah.
You briefly mentioned Franklin Graham. Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between Billy Graham and Franklin Graham, and how you see Franklin Graham's ministry today, especially with some of its more divisive aspects relating to Billy Graham's legacy?
You asked me if I would talk about that. No. No, I'm teasing, obviously. It's a question that comes up, and reporters constantly ask me. They say, who will be the successor? And then they say, tell us about Franklin. I don't have inside information. I did not study Franklin on purpose, so I probably don't know a great deal more than anyone in this room does. I think Franklin is an extraordinarily complicated figure. He founded and is the CEO of Samaritan's Purse, which the press seems almost never to notice. Samaritan's Purse last year gave away more than $500 million in direct aid. No questions asked. And some of that aid goes into Muslim countries, digging wells, building clinics. So that's one side of Franklin. The other side of Franklin is he's a culture warrior. And his father was not, and I'm absolutely certain that if Mr. Graham were younger and could respond to that question, I'm absolutely certain that his father would not endorse Franklin's culture war positions. And he would agree with some of those positions, but his attitude would be an ironic one, and his attitude would be, to go back to what I said earlier, bring as many people as you can within the voice of the gospel. There's just no need to alienate people. Have a sense of priorities. He talked a lot about scale. Some things are just more important than others, and what's most important is to bring people to faith in Christ. And a lot of the things that Franklin's worried about are things that Graham, the senior Graham, just relegated to a lower place. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Sir, thank you very much for your presentation. So my question, first of all, is what is your favorite biography of Billy Graham? And then if you wouldn't mind discussing a little bit of the scholarship behind that favorite biography, justifying why it is your favorite. Thank you.
Okay, good question. And I've been talking about Graham a whole bunch since the book came out, and actually before that, and nobody's ever asked that question. So that's a unique question. Thank you. By far the best book on Billy Graham is that written by William Martin. Bill Martin is retired now, long retired, but he was a sociologist, not a historian. And every time I see Bill, I say, why? Why would you be a sociologist? I mean, aren't you called to be a historian? But he was a sociologist who wrote as a historian, and he wrote a very fat book called Prophet with Honor. And then it's the story of Billy Graham. It came out in 1991. Then a little bit after that, there was a children's edition, Zondervan children's version. And Bill has an updated version ready to go when that sad day comes that Mr. Graham leaves us. By far the best book. It's extremely detailed, and it may give you a lot more information about Graham than you want, but it's wonderfully written. Very funny, actually. My own book is not in a league with Bill Martin's, but it's quite different in that I try to look at themes. Graham as a preacher, Graham as a political figure, Graham as a pastor, Graham in the context of American politics. So I follow it thematically. And the reason I did that was because I thought Bill had already told the main narrative story. And so I didn't want to reproduce what he was doing, but rather I wanted to be able to slice the career in other ways and look more closely at that career. Yeah. I mean, for example, one of the things I look at a great deal is how often the press commented on his looks. And I've looked at a lot of the obituaries that will be coming, as I say, when that sad day comes. And almost always the obituaries make a comment in the first paragraph about how stunningly handsome he was, and then how that facilitated the proclamation of his gospel. Yeah. Good. It's a good question. Yeah. Okay.
I would just ask you, in terms of the huge mega churches that have proliferated and the superstars, Joel Osteen and his ilk, no offense to anyone who may be a huge fan, whatever, but where do you see that in the context of Billy Graham?
Yeah, wonderful question. Did you hear the question, how would I compare Billy Graham with the prosperity preachers, say like Joel Osteen? Did I get that right, Cheryl? Yeah. Close enough, huh? Okay. There's a very fine line between practical advice and prosperity preaching. And Graham's ministry, as I suggested, is filled with practical advice. Advice about how parents ought to treat their kids. Advice to adolescents about how to get along with your parents. And that's the way it came. Here's some advice on how to get along with those older folks, yeah? So it's just very, very down home. Some of it had to do with managing your finances. Don't spend too much. Don't overspend your credit cards. It's advice like that. But Graham was very clear to say that faith will help you deal with your problems, but it won't make them go away. And I think there's a world of difference between saying Christ will help you work through your problems, but he's not going to eliminate. Graham's ministry is not a deliverance ministry. I don't know of any instance in his entire life when he, for example, laid hands on a person for healing. It's possible that he did, but it certainly was not part of that public ministry. Let Christ help you through life. And that was the essence of what I think he had to offer. Yeah.
So I'm struck by that Bob Dylan quotation. And
By the which quotation?
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, yeah.
So Billy Graham brought the storm down, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And videos that I've seen of the Crusades in the 50s, it does look like, at least, if not Billy, or Mr. Graham, sorry, Cliff Barrows that does a pretty good imitation of Elvis Presley. But by the 70s, Billy is a brand, and he's more like IBM. Mm-hmm. So do you have any sense that Billy was aware of losing an edge and maybe wanting to get it back, or was it part of reaching a wider audience to become a brand?
Absolutely, yes. Let me take that question in parts. Graham was acutely aware of the importance of Cliff Barrows and George Beverly Shea, and that's a whole other story in itself. It's a book in itself, and our friend Edith Boomhofer is writing a whole book on Cliff Barrows and George Beverly Shea and their role. And Graham himself had no musical ability. Shea said of Graham that he has the malady of no melody. He couldn't hum a tune, all right? But he understood the power of music in his crusades. And so actually the very first associate he hired was George Beverly Shea. So he was aware of their effectiveness, and actually, Darrell, in the beginning, they were billed as three. And you look at the early bills, they say George Beverly Shea, Cliff Barrows, and Billy Graham. And soon Graham moved out in front. Graham was aware that he had to keep track with the times, and he let his hair grow long, for example. And it's interesting that a lot of the letters that came in bashed him for having too long hair. But he did. His hair was, way down over his collar. And in other ways, they brought in a wide variety of musical artists, of rock and roll, of country music, gospels, even music that was distinctive of other ethnic groups. He worked very hard to bring a great variety of musical traditions. But when I say he worked very hard, that's a misnomer. Cliff did. This was Cliff Barrows' genius to know that you had to bring in a variety of musical forms and that would keep the message current. So in a sense, it was Graham doing that in that he authorized and supported Barrows for everything that he did. But Barrows was the one that had his antenna out very much. I was at the 95th birthday party, and the only thing, and Cliff Barrows was there, he was 85 at that time, And the only thing that Graham said at the party, it was at the end, he asked for the microphone, and he said, it was all possible because of Cliff. And I think that's very characteristic of him. I mean, his humility, but also his sense of great gratitude to what Cliff Barrows and Shay had done for him. Yeah, great question, yeah.
You teach at Duke, so you've probably heard of Methodists and Wesley's skills at organizing people around him for success. So my question is going to be to what extent Billy Graham, and it's been half answered by that last question, but before you answer it, of the extent to which Billy relied on his team and how he pulled his team together, I met you on, I want to share something with this audience. I met you on Sunday, and then yesterday I went out and interviewed a gentleman that I think you folks would like to know about. His name is Harold Munn. He's a Hillsdale College class of 47. His father was the dean here. And I said to him, please tell me about your first encounter with Billy Graham. And I wrote this down. He says, my first early meeting with Billy was in Longhouse on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii. We had 20 or so ministers there. And there was a little guy next to me, a missionary from Polynesia. He could hardly wait for a comment time, and when that time came, Billy, at the end of the table, was sitting next to me, and the missionary was on the other side of me. The missionary popped up out of his chair and said, Billy, there are 20,000 islands in Polynesia where there is no Christian witness, and if you were to spend one day on each island, it would take you 60 years to reach them. Billy turned to me and said, Harold, we've got to do something about that. So here's your Hillsdale College alumnus. The upshot was that we put in the most powerful AM station ever built in Hawaii, 50,000 watts, with a signal directed into Polynesia, operating on a frequency that fit between the channels used in both Australia and Japan, a clear channel. Because of that station, during its period of operation, we heard from all over the world because we literally had worldwide coverage. So Billy was surrounded by technological geniuses on the cutting edge of media, as well as musicians and so on that you saw on the stage. So I wonder what you can tell us about the behind-the-scenes operation of the Billy Graham organization.
Well, I'd like to go back to the question the gentleman in the back asked about other books on Graham. One of the books that desperately needs to be written is a book about the organization of the Graham organization. Harold Myra has one called Leadership Secrets of Billy Graham, but it doesn't get into the organizational part very much. And the organization was a finely tuned machine. Graham himself was disorganized by all accounts of the family. He was disorganized, he was a fusser, he was a nail biter, he was all this, but he knew what his limitations were, and he had an astute ability to hire people who could do what he could not. And so early on, he hired George Wilson, who was a superb business manager in Minneapolis, and he turned it over to Wilson. Having said that, what I also see in my research is that everybody knew that at the end of the day, Graham held the other end of the rope. He wasn't just turn it over and then let other people do whatever they wanted to do. He called in every single day to ask about the finances and the operation and what was going on. So it's a mixed story. It's a story of delegation, but with control. And obviously it worked, and it worked magnificently. There's one other point I'd say there, Dan, and that is Graham also had a clear sense that he could do some things that no one else could do. He could stand in front of 100,000 people and issue an invitation, and hundreds would come forward. He knew that he could do that in a way that no one else could do. So he reserved that role for himself, but he delegated other things to this wonderful organization he put together. Yeah. These are great questions. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
This conference and previous ones, we hear a lot about gloom and doom that seems to have been descended onto America almost for the last 50 years. When you spoke last with Billy Graham, did he share a little bit in this gloom and doom look to the moral decay, as many would call it?
I'm sorry, my ear, I just didn't catch it. Can you help me, Matt, maybe, or somebody?
Did Billy Graham share in the gloom and doom of the
Well,
that we talk about here
yeah.
in those conferences?
That's an interesting question. He was a dispensationalist, a premillennialist, but he never preached it. There are a lot of things that Graham believed privately, but he did not preach about because he thought it was divisive. And so when he founded Christianity Today, one of the founding planks of Christianity Today was that they would never touch dispensationalism because he knew it was divisive. So there was a theology that recognized the coming of apocalypse. But my own view of this is that it was wallpaper. I was there. I don't think he took it all that seriously. He was not an introspective man. When he looked inside, what he saw were sunny skies. He wasn't introspective. And one time he said to Larry King, "I don't have many cloudy days." And I think that's very interesting that he said that about himself. He was a man with a happy disposition most of the time, and I think that translated into the sermons. Now, the sermons always started with some apocalyptic events that were coming, but very quickly those sermons moved into the solution phase for these dire events. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.